Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on Tour to G7 Climate Club. I'm Stephanie Segal. I'm a senior fellow with the Economics Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm very happy that we have a great panel for this discussion. Before I turn it over to them, let me just introduce the topic of a climate club against the current backdrop where here in the United States, there's recently been passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, notwithstanding the name, is actually being billed as the largest single piece of climate legislation ever passed in the United States. It provides hundreds of billions in incentives to speed the development and adoption of green technologies, and really does move the bar quite a bit in helping the United States meet its reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. But it is also a policy that is set very much on domestic objectives. And so while it is a huge step forward on the domestic front, it also begs the question of what action on the international front and what activities there are to speed multilateral cooperation. And so it's against that backdrop that we're going to discuss the potential of a G7 climate club. And I'm very happy that we have as our speakers here, folks that have been following these issues, including Mr. Steffen Meyer, the Director General for Economic, Financial, and Climate Policy at the German Federal Chancellery. It is under the G7 presidency of Germany that the proposal for a G7 climate club was made with leader support at the summit in June. So I'm going to turn first to Steffen, but let me just briefly introduce our other panelists. We also have with us Danae Kyriakopoulou, who is Senior Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment from the London School of Economics. We also have Amar Bhattacharya, who is Senior Fellow for Global Economy and Development at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution, and Claire Healy, who is Director for the U.S. office of the think tank E3G. So with that introduction, Steffen, let me turn it over to you for just an introduction and maybe a bit of background on the Climate Club proposal that was made at the Leaders Summit.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Let me really give the basics behind this idea and then keep all the other elements and topics for the discussion that we are going to have later on. What's the motivation behind the chancellors, the German chancellors, back then still finance ministers, proposal to establish an open and cooperative climate club? Currently, with climate targets tabled by all countries, as you all know, we're on a path to a 2.7 degree world with severe implications for our security, our well-being, and our economies. We need to make the 2020s the decade of transformation. That's the main motivation the Chancellor has. Carbon dioxide emissions need to peak as soon as possible and need to be reduced almost by half until 2030 to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming limit in reach. Looking at the transformation of our industries, we see promising developments, but still too slow to embark a 1.5 degree emission reduction pathway. We face a collective action problem. When it comes to effective climate policy addressing trade-intensive sectors, governments are worried that industrial production will move to countries with lower ambition levels. We can only escape this dilemma by working closer together, by intensifying international cooperation, as you alluded to, on the next industrial revolution. The Climate Club will be open to all countries that are committed to a swift implementation of the Paris Agreement and that are willing to work towards joint action to drive the decarbonization of our industries. What are the three pillars of the proposal of the Climate Club? The first pillar is advance ambitious and transparent climate mitigation policies on the pathway towards climate neutrality, share best practices, ensure comparability, and higher degree of compatibility of policies of club members. A higher degree of policy alignment will also, and that's a very important point, reduce risks of trade frictions or trade wars due to unilateral measures. The second pillar, we should agree on joint standards and possibly also sectoral strategies and milestones on industrial decarbonization. We should develop, for example, common definitions for green materials, as well as standards of public procurement and joint R&D priorities. The result will be a major push for expanding lead markets for green industrial products. And the third pillar, countries face different circumstances in decarbonizing and developing their industries. We want to support developing and emerging economies in leapfrogging into climate-friendly industrial development. The Climate Club aims to mobilize investments through sectoral and technical cooperation. And the Just Energy Transition Partnerships will also contribute to this pillar by accelerating transition to a climate-friendly energy system. What's the further process? At the G7 summit in Elmau, leaders agreed on the concept that I laid out and on concrete steps towards founding an open and cooperative climate club. The G7 will aim for comprehensive terms of references until end of this year, and they will do intensive outreach to international partners and international organizations to support us as G7 in this endeavor. I will stop here with the overview and give back to you.
Thanks a lot, Steffen. I think that helps us kick off this conversation for sure. I'd like to invite audience members. We will have some time at the end for Q&A, so please do submit your questions. There's a button there on the website to do so. I wanted to turn first then in responding to both what Steffen had said, but then also reflecting a good deal of work that I know has already gone into fleshing out a bit of the potential for the proposal and go to Danae. As I mentioned, Danae is with Grantham Research Institute. I believe you all have actually written a report on the Climate Club. So if you could maybe bring us through some of the findings in that report and also address one of the concerns that have been raised about what might be the additionality of such a climate club. How is it different or differentiated from other efforts that are already underway?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here. That is correct. The LSE, the Grantham Research Institute, was commissioned by the German G7 presidency to do an independent report on the Climate Club. This was commissioned to Professor Nick Stern, and as a team, we supported that effort. The report has not been published yet and will be published later in the year. So with that in mind, I think it's worth reflecting on the moment we find ourselves in. I think Dr. Meyer set that out very well in terms of the urgency. We have seen the world come together behind the goals of the Paris Agreement. We saw a lot of progress in Glasgow at COP26, but at the same time, the follow-up actions have fell short in terms of what is needed, and we're seeing this both in terms of global government commitments, notwithstanding the Inflation Reduction Act, which you mentioned in the beginning, which is a very important development. But there is this sense of urgency to go further, faster, that is motivating the need to go beyond that. And this is also happening in a context of increasingly fractured geopolitical and economic stress. And this creates a space for climate as an issue where the world can come together and collaborate. And an important opportunity for that to happen is the backdrop to the Climate Club emerging. I think the pillars, as Dr. Meyer laid them out, are setting the makeup of the club in terms of how it would be structured architecturally. To your question about what gap does it fill, there are already a lot of fora where climate features very prominently. Beyond the UNFCCC, there is the G7 and the G20 have climate on their agendas. We have thematic or particular agents that have coalesced around the climate issue, for example, the Network for Greening the Financial System or the Coalition of Finance Ministers, the Major Economies Forum, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero in the private sector. There is the Sustainable Markets Initiative. So climate features virtually in every forum. But what we are seeing lacking is a space where this is dealt at the highest level, at the leaders level, and where there are countries joining with a criterion of their ambition. The UNFCCC is inclusive. It includes countries that may be holding back progress, and the G20 and G7 also have other items on their agenda, while the NGFS or the Coalition of Finance Ministers have a particular angle through which they are looking at the climate issues. So this is where the Climate Club can make a difference in terms of combining engagement at the very top level, in terms of filtering or screening countries that have this high shared level of ambition, and in terms of being designed to not duplicate existing processes, because there are already so many initiatives, and you're very right to raise this issue of additionality, but act as an umbrella of initiatives supporting and reinforcing and accelerating action across all those levels. The proposal is not for a new institution, for more bureaucracy, but for working with existing initiatives. And also, very importantly, the three pillars that we heard about, to enable countries to negotiate across these pillars and work together across these pillars, not just thinking about, for example, the finance partnerships or the technology partnerships as separate, to the objective of shared measurement of mitigation and emissions, or the sectoral agreements that are all very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Danae. There's a lot in what you just said that I'd like to follow up on. And the point is taken that I guess the key piece of additionality here may well be leaders' engagement and their ability then to direct action. That then begs the question, action on which priorities? And I'd like to get back to that during our discussion. But before we do that, let me turn next to Amar. And you, I think I said in your introduction, you're there at Brookings. You've obviously been engaged in the work of development and also sustainability for a number of years, and also bringing in the perspective of countries that are not represented in the G7. Could you speak a little bit about, I think one of the reactions I mentioned, additionality and questions about that with the G7 Climate Club, also questions about the membership of such a club. And Steffen alluded to something that is actually open, but could you speak more to kind of what is the right group of countries that should be engaged in this sort of initiative, given the very ambitious goals that Steffen laid out?
As Steffen pointed out, inclusion is key to relevance and success of such a club. So let me begin with just posing the question, what is in it for emerging markets and developing countries, and why are emerging markets and developing countries important to the notion of a club? So, it's very well known that climate change will have a disproportionate impact on poor and vulnerable countries. And, we've been seeing that, in recent events, for example, in Pakistan, the tremendous impacts of climate change. Second, in terms of emissions, you can break the world into three kind of blocks: advanced economies, which account for roughly a third of global emissions; China, which accounts for a third of global emissions; and emerging markets and developing countries other than China, which accounts for a third of global emissions. So in advanced economies, of course, we expect, based on the commitments made, a dramatic decline in the 2030s. China also should be seeing large declines given, what its share of global emissions is, and the possibilities open to China. emerging markets and developing countries at very different, positions in terms of their development trajectories. So for them, they will become the largest source of incremental emissions. So having them in the tent is very important. Second, in order to be able to curb the emissions, there is a necessity to actually use investment as a driver of change. Investment so that all new investments are done in a way that, as Steffen pointed out, enables these countries to leapfrog, an investment to change the existing stock of capital. How much investment? We estimate that emerging markets and developing countries, other than China, will need to invest about $2 to $2.5 trillion by 2030 in order to meet climate objectives. That's a very large sum of money that will have to be spent, but the quality of that spending will also matter a great deal. A second point about emerging markets and developing countries is that their policy mix is likely to be quite different than that of advanced economies. There's a lot of discussion about carbon pricing. Even within the G7, as you know, there's a lot of heterogeneity. And when it comes to emerging markets and developing countries, we will have to deploy a wide spectrum of policies to move the needle at the pace that it needs to move at. And that has to be taken into account, policy diversity, and emerging markets and developing countries will be, in different points on that. And the final point I want to make with regard to emerging markets and developing countries, and it relates very much to the investment imperative, is the criticality of finance and technology. So without, a major scale up of finance from all sources, domestic, international, public, and private, we are not going to be able to make the transformation at the pace needed and scale up green investments that are necessary. So tackling the challenge of finance is in the interest of all countries, helping these countries. And, a club like this could play a very important role. So what's the role of a club as far as emerging markets and developing countries is concerned? To ensure that they feel part of the global effort, that they are committed to the objective of raising ambition, that they are, in some sense, included in the discussions around the rules of the game, that this is not a club about sanctions, but about cooperative behavior to raise ambition and to raise ambition on action, not just on commitments. And finally, to have mechanisms so that we can get finance and technology, at the levels that are needed to enable these countries to commit to the ambition that is necessary. So from the get-go, emerging markets and developing countries must feel that this is a club in which they have as much of a stake as does the G7.
Thanks, Amar. And I would just kind of go back and underscore a point that you made initially in your comments. Beyond the need for buy-in is just the reality of where the majority of emissions going forward are forecasted to come from. And that is not necessarily from the advanced economies, but from emerging markets. So that to reach kind of the overall goals here, there needs to be inclusion of key emerging market emitters. So just to second the point that you raised there, I'm going to come back and revisit some of the points there that you raised as well, but let me pull Claire into the conversation now as well, and also inject, I guess, a bit of skepticism in the sense that, as Danae listed, there are many different initiatives that have already been launched and maybe have some lessons for where there are obstacles and where there might be scope for progress. I know you've done a lot of work looking at some of those other sectoral agreements. So could you maybe give us a bit of, your view on the Climate Club proposal and also what we might be able to learn from some other initiatives that are already out there, including the U.S. EU steel agreement?
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Stefan, for putting this topic on the agenda. I should say from the beginning, so E3G, we're in favor of more ambition and faster decarbonisation. And Stefan said at the top end, if we ground ourselves in the objective of trying to halve emissions, global emissions, by 2030, I think we have to start looking at creative ways of getting countries to cooperate, to those countries that want to do more and go faster. I think that should be encouraged. However, when you look, as you said, Stephanie, across the spectrum, there are a plethora of initiatives with clubs of countries trying to figure this out, whether it's a specific sector, like you just mentioned, the EU-US Green Steel deal, or a group of other countries, for example, like the Clean Energy Ministerial Industrial Decarbonisation, Deep Decarbonisation Initiative, and many more. We've already talked about the JETPs and First Movers Coalition. There are many, right? So I think the first recommendation we would make to the German government, who's holding the pen on this, is to build on existing initiatives, look what's out there, and there are many good initiatives out there with robust secretariats, with a good mandate, with already quite a lot of buy-in and track record, and see how this idea of a club or an alliance of countries that want to do more, how it could plug gaps, as others have said. And so specifically, we see a need for a space for more of a political conversation, because when we start talking about industrial decarbonisation and bringing in, as Amar said, emerging market economies, the first thing we hit up against is the need to sort of figure out some fair play rules. And so we need sort of a space where you can have more of a political conversation about what these fair play rules should look like, and not just stick to the technicalities. Obviously, there's a lot of technical work to do to figure out what those rules would be, whether it be, product standards or public procurement. But when we look across the landscape, we see lots of good technical progress being made, but not a lot of space for some of the political conversations. So I think this club, this alliance, could be that sort of higher level political space that takes stock of progress, like what are the initiatives that currently exist, what are they achieving, how far are we getting in terms of industrial transition and deep decarbonisation, and then looking at how we create those rules. And as Amar said, the criticality of support, not just financial support. And again, even on that, there's an existing vehicle, for example, the Industrial Transition Fund at the CIFs, the Climate Investment Funds. When you look, there's existing structures and vehicles already. So if this club or alliance of countries, as we prefer, those that want to do more, go faster, if they could sort of look at how they plug gaps, have a space for these political conversations, and figure out among many countries what those fair play rules are in terms of carbon leakage and support for industry. So that's what we would love to see this club, this alliance become.
Thanks, Claire. That's very helpful as far as drilling down a little bit and getting a bit more specific on what the club might be able to achieve, what the priorities could potentially be. I'm starting to get a couple of questions in. I would ask anyone in the audience that has questions to please go ahead and submit those, and we'll try to get to as many as we can during our conversation. The first question actually that I'm seeing here relates to something that I did want to ask you about, the panel, and a few of you actually alluded to it already in your comments, and that is the question of pricing of carbon. I think maybe in the origin story of the Climate Club, there was before that, I think, talk of a carbon club that would focus on carbon pricing and how to kind of level the playing field when it comes to trade in carbon intensive goods. Could maybe starting with Stefan, but I invite any of the panelists to comment on it. Where does carbon pricing kind of fit, or does it in such a club? And if it were to be included, what does that mean in terms of membership of the club? Stefan, let me go to you, but anyone else that would like to jump in on that question, please do.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just say, I can agree to all what the previous speakers have said. So I think that's a very good sign, many issues to be solved. But on your point on the carbon pricing, now agreeing on a joint minimum level of carbon pricing could of course be one way to reach further policy alignment and coming closer to a level playing field especially for trade intensive industrial products. However, I think the German government fully respects that different national circumstances of our partners and that other jurisdictions have preferences for other instruments such as regulatory measures. So there are other ways to reach a higher degree of comparability and compatibility to achieve this level playing field. It actually will be one of the tasks for the Climate Club to also advance the methodological work, the very technical questions, how we can better compare the different paths to ambitious climate neutrality objectives. Having said that, one more sentence from my side. As you indicated, it's that reason of different pathways that some shift has happened in focusing more on this aspect of transformation, which then of course is very much linked to the question of level playing field. And I think the important point will be to advance on both fronts because they are very much interlinked. And if you bring in emerging and developing countries into the picture, then you have a very consistent way forward.
Danae, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. No, it's a very good question. And I would like to highlight that the principle of inclusiveness is really at the heart of this project. That's why I think also Claire's point of calling it an alliance is very important as well, because this is not a club that keeps some in and some out. And that does not only apply to inviting emerging markets and developing countries in, but also inclusiveness in terms of the different policy mix that prospective members may have. And carbon pricing is absolutely in a market economy the most important and effective way of keeping emissions down, but we have to recognize and be inclusive towards countries that will also have different policy mixes. And that's really important in terms of building that critical mass of the membership that is needed to move the needle on this. And also the complementarity of the different pillars, the sectoral agreements, the finance partnerships will over the long term create that convergence that will ultimately, over time, make the need to manage friction and the frictions that result from different paces in ambition unnecessary, because you through finance partnerships, through sectoral agreements for decarbonization, you no longer need to manage that leakage because you bring countries at more or less the same level and you encourage that convergence. So it's also a dynamic process through which the managing frictions from different pace in terms of ambition and carbon pricing becomes less relevant. And that's something that the Climate Club also has at its heart in terms of being inclusive.
Thanks, Danae. Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of the adage of you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think everybody on this Zoom has an economics background. I think there's been kind of consensus from an economic perspective about the criticality of pricing in a market economy scenario, and yet we haven't been able to advance that. And so, the ability to look at other ways to advance the agenda, I think, is critical, notwithstanding the fact that there are huge efficiency gains to having that pricing element. Amar, you had a comment as well on this.
Yes, Stephanie. Just to say that, as you said, we economists agree that carbon pricing is the most effective instrument that we know. It is also, as Stefan pointed out, a very essential part of being able to set a level playing field because it's something measurable. Having said that, there are many ways to get a carbon price equivalent. In the US, for example, there is a social price on carbon, but the instruments that are being used are not directly, market-based, as it were. And the last point I would make is that, in achieving, the ultimate objective, which is a reduction in emissions, there are, of course, other instruments than carbon pricing, including things like regulations and standards. And again, they have been deployed quite effectively in many jurisdictions. And so, as Steffen said, that the main objective should be to try and get a better understanding about effectiveness in different circumstances, but also the results matter. So can we try and develop metrics that allows us to get greater comparability while recognizing differences in circumstances?
Thanks. And a few things there that I want to return to kind of on the metrics and standard side of things. Before I do that, Claire, you have your hand up as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just to endorse, again, the function we're trying to solve here is faster emission reductions, right, from industry and from developed and emerging economies. So I think we could spend a lot of time, or waste a lot of time, I should say, like, as you said, going after the perfect, the economically pure pricing instrument, but we don't have that time to waste. So I would concur, and I think we have to be a bit more pragmatic and look at other criteria for this convergence of ambition. And again, there's lots of other avenues. It could be, GHG pledges in the short term, product standards in the medium term, and really push that technical work, or procurement. There are lots of other metrics we could use to really drive emission reductions. I would say just a couple of things. I was intrigued by what Steffen said about, the sort of the nascent work looking at embodied carbon in products and services. I mean, you mentioned the green steel deal, which again, we're very supportive of, but we're really trying to get a better sense of what is the actual work that's taking place there. And that's just one or two sectors with two jurisdictions. Perhaps, again, I don't know this, but Steffen may have a view. If there's another space where, again, the group of countries that opt in could figure out how we measure embodied carbon in a multitude of goods and services. And perhaps this is the sort of vehicle through which we could do that and make faster progress. I'll say just one final thing on the sort of the communication of this. We're talking about clubs versus alliances. I think club just sounds a bit more exclusive. We've all had the experiences of, wanting to get into a club, be a member of a club, where it's clear what the membership dues are and what we get out of it. But in this instance, it does feel a bit too exclusive. So while we talk about an alliance of countries, that does sound a bit softer in tone, but I don't think we should soften the way we measure the ambition. I don't think we should be soft about how we measure ambition. What we need this to be is lead to material reductions in industrial emissions. So however we measure that, we need to figure that out pretty quickly and be clear about that. And then, as Amar said, make sure we give support to those countries that want in and want to go further faster.
Thanks, Claire. That's also kind of the perfect segue to the topic I wanted to get to next, which is on measurement, standards for measurement, and also if I could expand a bit the topic of standards beyond just measurement, but also reporting and disclosure. I'd like to get views from this group as to kind of where you see progress, both on the measurement side and on the disclosure side. Is there reason to be helpful or hopeful on that front? I note that the G7 leaders communique actually did recognize work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a relatively new creation. So there does appear to be progress and buy-in there. But what can we say about kind of the current status of measurement and standards? And is there work there that a club could be helpful in advancing? Anyone want to kind of be the first speaker on that topic?
I mean, I can come in real quick in just indicating that the OECD is doing now a lot of technical work on the question of measurement of different approaches on explicit versus implicit prices, regulation, standards, etc. So that's work that's already ongoing. And then, of course, you indicated the work on the disclosure side. I think that's very important. I just wanted to underline one more time, because I think both Claire and Amar put it very intelligently, that you need the two elements. You need the political discussions, the political conversation. And this is where the German Chancellor really started. He really comes from the perspective, we are in difficult economic times, and we need to start those kinds of discussions, because if we want to be ambitious, if we want to move forward, if we want to move from commitments to real action, then we need to have those kinds of discussions, building trust, and then this moving to concrete action. And for the concrete action, we need the technical work. We should certainly bring in the expertise and what we learned from other multilateral or bilateral discussions, and try to use those for the more multilateral decisions that might be taken then within this club or alliance. I think the name in the end is not that important, because what we anyhow have to do is go round and explain in several rounds what this club means. And if you do that and people understand, then the importance of club or alliance is not that much in the fore anymore. So I wanted to underline, it has to go in parallel, the political discussions plus the technical work, and then we can make important progress going forward.
Thanks, Stefan. And clearly, right, when we're talking about measurement and standard setting, we're into the technical, but I take your point. I think the political buy-in to advance that technical agenda is essential. Anybody else want to weigh in on this question of kind of standard setting before we move on? Amar, go ahead.
So I was going to say that there are many levels at which issues of comparability and measurement arise. The first one is really at the level of ambition. And one metric, as you know, that has been put out there is net zero. When are you going to reach net zero? And that is not a bad way to think about it, except, of course, we understand that not all countries would be appropriately at net zero at the same time. Nevertheless, it's a metric. It's a metric about ambition. Second, for a group like this, it's extremely important to think about, aggregate effort. Are the efforts in aggregate going to get us to net zero by mid-century? So I do think that both at the individual country level as well as the aggregate level, thinking about effort and how it relates to science-based targets is an important aspect of measurement. Second, we have to talk about measurement of policy. And there, of course, carbon pricing is one way. And IMF and OECD have been working very, on this methodology of how you look at carbon pricing equivalence as a way to think. And as Stefan pointed out, OECD is extending that to think about other policies that should be counted as part of the policy effort. And again, the question is, how do we measure comparability around those? And then there is a final part where measurement also becomes very important, and particularly in terms of a level playing field, and that is at the sector level. There you are, you have to sort of think about, how do we create a level playing field? And, for example, how do you measure the carbon intensity of output? That's another technical issue that has to be sorted out. So in thinking about measurement and metrics, we should recognize that we have to think about this in terms of goals. We have to think about it in terms of policies, and particularly where issues of competitiveness are concerned in terms of a level playing field.
Thanks a lot, Amar, for that. And you mentioned again kind of the sectoral piece that I want to come back to. Claire, you got your hand up too on the standards one. Go ahead.
In terms of measuring emissions reduction, I think there's a lot of work going on in various forums, whether it's tons of CO2 in terms of NDCs or very micro in terms of a specific sector. I think, when you look at 90% of the global economy has committed to net zero, and this is for the duration now, to mid-century, I think we should be thinking more creatively, I think, in economy-wide on metrics that could really sort of drive decarbonization efforts. And I am, for example, we could be thinking of creating a new composite index, such as a national decarbonization rate that sits alongside GDP. And so we could be looking at where that could be created and sit maybe at the IMF. And then you could imagine a scenario in years hence where that then gets connected to incentives and rewards for those countries that go further faster. For example, perhaps they could access a lower cost of capital or more de-risking instruments. I think we have to look at these economy-wide measures and indices, right? So while the work and the technical work and the knowledge sharing and collaboration may take place at a sector by sector level, we need to wrap that up, I think, at an economy-wide, because clearly we need better measures to track progress, right? And national decarbonization rate, is not beyond our collective efforts. I just wanted to say something about what Steffen said about the politics being in parallel with the technical. Before I joined E3G, I worked at the U.S. Department of Energy in their international affairs team, working on the SEM and MI. It's the time when MI, Mission Innovation, was launched. So I had some insight into how you create a new initiative, set the terms of engagement, the membership criteria. In that instance, it was countries could opt in if they agreed to double their R&D spend on clean energy technologies. And then, setting up the secretariat and setting up, we had dual processes where you had the politics, where ministers got together to put some political muscle and top-down pressure. And then you had these technical working groups. And I liked that model. And I think Steffen is right, having these both in parallel, where you have the political space. And again, the G7 is not the right space for it, nor at the moment, unfortunately, is the G20. So a new group of countries that come together to figure out sort of the politics of this. We need a space where they can direct the traffic. If we're going to devolve the technical work, the support structures, build on existing initiatives that already have good governance structures and secretariats, including the UNIDO's developing country industrial platform, right? There's lots of good work out there, but to fill those gaps and direct the traffic, we need that higher level political space that can also troubleshoot along the way, because these things will get political as we figure out these fair play rules, and also track progress. But I'm a great believer in not just, as you said, Stephanie, earlier, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, but where there's a will, there's a way. And if we get the political muscle behind this, I think this could potentially be a really exciting space.
Thanks, Claire. Danae, do you want to jump in here too?
Yes, I think just bringing this back to the principles of the Climate Club, and we mentioned inclusiveness in terms of different policy mixes and priorities, but also respect for international rules. And that includes the common but differentiated responsibility and recognizing countries' different starting points. But while involving and including and welcoming members at different starting points and with different policy mixes is absolutely at the heart of the club, these differences in policies will create the risk of carbon leakage. And while the club in itself is not a space to create a common carbon price, it is a space to manage those frictions and to air those differences and to work in partnership with the World Trade Organization and other bodies in terms of having these conversations and acting as a space for members to be able to manage those differences. And that's in terms of sharing best practice, in terms of anti-leakage measures, measures, in terms of developing methodologies for equivalence. And we heard about the work of the OECD on this. That's been very important. So it can also be a forum for managing policy diversity as much as a space for welcoming countries that have policy diversity. And then I also wanted to talk more about the opportunities as well, because we've been talking about managing friction, managing diversity, the risks if we don't act fast on mitigation, but this is also a club of opportunity, and particularly the finance pillar. And we heard earlier about the importance of supporting emerging and developing economies that will be, if they don't follow the correct path, will be major emitters in the future. But this is also an investment opportunity for capital in developed economies that has committed to aligning with net zero. And that's where the finance partnerships come in as well. We have seen the development of partnerships, such as, for example, in the South Africa case, and this can happen much more systematically in the space of the Climate Club. This is a positive investment story as much as one of managing frictions and diversity.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. And I mean, a lot of, I mentioned kind of at the top, the passage of the IRA, and then the reception of that legislation, and what you hear from the private sector in particular about exactly, as you said, Danae, the opportunity that's there, and recognizing the transition not just as one that is essential kind of for our climate future, but also one that actually could be economic opportunity, and recognizing the transformation itself as one that could be positive for growth, even though there will be some adjustment and structural shifts along the way. So I agree wholeheartedly with that framing. Steffen, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to make, I agree with everything I heard, but I just wanted to make the point again. I think Amar made the point, we need to get into action. And I just wanted to emphasize one more time, I think that the Climate Club can be that nucleus that really brings us into action. If you take the example of Germany or globally, we do have the technologies in the industrial sector that we need. Basically, we have them, or they are in development, maybe a couple of years, and hydrogen can be very competitive. What we have at the same time also in Germany is that companies are reluctant to invest because they do not have the certainty what will happen. And one major element is that they do not know, will there be countries that are not playing fair? We don't have a level playing field, so they are reluctant with investment. And I think that's really something where one can be a little bit enthusiastic about this opportunity to have the forum where we bring forward that we jumpstart action. And I think that's really important. Instead of trade frictions, jumpstart action. Define what is a green steel market. You could define what could be a global network for transporting hydrogen, many elements that you could discuss and bring forward. And in doing so, if you bring in more and more interested and ambitious countries, you can really create this positive dynamic that is really really badly needed, because having even more ambitious NDCs will not help if we are not really getting into action. So I just wanted to kind of, it's the core of the thinking of my chancellor, and I think that's extremely important because it's nice to see that everybody is in favor, and we need to create, in talking to many others, this kind of environment where more and more countries understand that something positive is in for them here.
Can I follow up on that? But maybe it goes a bit in the opposite direction, and it's a very kind of 40,000 foot question, but I think it is kind of essential to membership in, let's call it an alliance. You all, I think, have said the importance of raising ambition. Can I ask specifically, if you were kind of the decision maker and said, this is the commitment that a country would need to make in order to be a member of this alliance, and then we're going to move ahead with the work agenda, what's the specific commitment that a country would need to make, and then back up with the actual technical work? Amar, go ahead.
So I'm going to draw a little bit parallel with the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action, which is also an ambition-based coalition. And, you know, the best way to think about ambition is you don't want the bar to be so high that discourages potential members from joining that will be critical to the success of the club. Ambition has to be thought of a little bit as a aspirational goal towards which you make concrete progress through actions of the kind that Steffen mentioned. So, you know, what that really does raise a question about how you define the entry criteria. And it is better to err on the inclusive side in terms of commitment to goals and commitment to actions to deliver the goals, rather than set, you know, very, very strict benchmarks, which might keep out, you know, important players that you want as part of this alliance. And that's a tension that we should explicitly recognize.
Thanks for that. I see Danae and Steffen, you both have your hands up. So Danae first and then Steffen.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely agree with this idea of a dynamic concept of ambition. I think to answer your question directly in terms of what this looks like, it needs to be centered on the Paris goals and the Glasgow progress, but also commitment to action and also collaboration, enabling others to deliver, recognizing that this is an agenda where others need to also, who may not have the resources, who may have the commitment to ambition, but not the means to live up to that ambition. And that is really where the three pillars of the Climate Club can make a difference, because there are countries that want to have the ambition, but also have to face the goals of development and have to be supported in terms of climate and development goals being achieved at the same time. And enabling others to deliver is really critical to have this dynamic element of ambition.
Steffen, did you want to come in here too?
Yeah, I can be very short. I can fully agree with Danae and Amar on this. It has to be dynamic, and ambition is key, and then helping countries, especially emerging and developing countries, in being in a position to live up to that ambition will be very important.
And Claire, you as well had put your hand up in response to this. Did you want to jump in here?
Yes, why not? I think in terms of specific sectors, that's something you asked about before, right? So we obviously referenced steel and aluminum, and there's obviously a space where Europe, US are trying to figure out what the technical threshold is there. We're trying to, as I said, get more insight to make sure the steel deal, the green steel deal, is actually a green steel deal and not just a steel deal. But that's, again, two jurisdictions, two sectors. And when you start, and from the US perspective, when you're looking at steel, they have an advantage, so you can understand the politics behind that. But if you open up the aperture a bit and look at other sectors where emissions are coming from and where they're growing in future, you start have to look spaces to figure out the technical standards in the chemical sector, obviously agriculture. These are very political industries. So again, once we start getting into those spaces, we've got to get the architecture right. I would say, Danae mentioned the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership that's going on with South Africa, which we're all encouraged by and want to see progress, including with the other countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. But just look at the energy and the heft it's taken, from the international partners group with the political leaders in South Africa and the unions, just to get that one deal. And we're not there yet. We have the political declaration, we're figuring out the package. And so while, as Danae said, we've got to think through how we do this systematically, right? And that's just looking at finance, for a coal to clean transition. And when you're looking at other countries and getting them to sign up and do more, the support structures, we're looking at technology transfer, technological know-how. And so we just don't, when you zoom out, we just don't have the architecture set up yet to do this in a very systematic way with the time that we have. So again, with the club or the alliance, I think it is going to take some real political muscle to actually set up the structures to get these support packages in place for faster industrial decarbonisation.
Yeah, and the point here, I think, on the right structure is well taken. It's also reflected in some of the questions that we've received as relates to kind of governance. I would be interested, and we're kind of at the 5-minute mark here. So I want to get your views on when we think about the structures that are in place or that would need to be put in place to actually execute on a leaders-driven climate alliance. I'd welcome any comments on what that sort of, we'll call it a governance structure, from the members of such an alliance. How is it, or what would be most effective as far as making sure that the line agencies that are responsible for delivering on the technical specifics are actually getting kind of the mandate and direction to do that? Does anybody have views on that question as far as how members of such an alliance would organize themselves in order to put real action behind intention? And Steffen, maybe if I could return to you as the one official sector participant on this roundtable.
So this is actually work that will be done within the G7. And as you know, there will be a group on the ministerial level that will work on specific terms of references for the Climate Club until end year, to then be endorsed by leaders. And we did a bit of initial thinking, and we thought to structure that work that one needs some kind of secretariat, also to coordinate and bring in the work done by the different international organizations, which will be very important. I mean, work by the IMF, work by the OECD was already mentioned. The World Bank will have to do important work, and they are doing that already, especially and also with regard to emerging countries. So that's important. We think that this club could think about some kind of scientific advisory board. We all indicated that this will be a dynamic process, that we will have to adjust again and again, because if this is successful, it will be a multi-year process. And then, of course, you need some kind of council, I would call it a climate club council or so, in which those members sit together and give the strategic guidance and take the strategic decisions once this is going over and above the G7, hopefully sometime over, if we're in better times, over and above the G20, reaching out to many emerging market and developing countries. So that's the kind of thinking, but that was one more time leapfrogging ahead. That's the discussion we're going to have in the G7. But giving this kind of structure, we thought could make sense, but we will have to discuss that with our partners.
Thanks, Steffen. Danae, I see you have your hand up. I see we're also at the 1 minute mark. If I could maybe do just a quick lightning round here and have you as panelists do my job for me in terms of summing up. If you could convey kind of a key 1 or 2 priorities for leaders that might be considering the formation of such a club or an alliance, what would those 1 or 2 priorities actually be? I can go kind of in maybe reverse speaking order, which would then give Steffen the final word here. But Claire, let me go to you first with that.
Okay, on the lightning round, we sort of see 3 layers on the criteria of membership. I would open it up beyond the G7, bringing in Indonesia, India, and other major emerging economies from the get-go. We've got to accommodate different starting points, just like the SEM IDDI does. Have actual support in place from the get-go, not just financial. using existing structures, like you could replenish the CIF industry trust fund. And thirdly, look at the governance structures and give a central role for the likes of UNIDO's developing country platform, and get the political in parallel with the technical, because we want faster industrial emission cuts. That's the name of the game here.
Great. Amar?
A political and technical force for action in a rather crowded landscape.
Okay, Danae.
Yeah, I think to be inclusive from the start, and that involves going beyond the G7 and co-ownership by both advanced and emerging and developing economies, and having this dynamic and understanding of ambition in terms of seeing this as a positive agenda for investment and development.
And Steffen, any kind of final remarks?
I mean, real quick from my side, I think transformation is key also for the club at this point. Second, inclusiveness, bring in emerging markets and developing countries, and be very specific there very quickly so that they understand what is in there for them. Thirdly, do not stop being optimistic on what we can achieve with this initiative. And finally, have long discussions if the name should be club or alliance.
Excellent. I was going to say one of my key takeaways is club is out and alliance is in, at least based on the conversation here. I just want to thank all of you for what I think was a very high quality discussion. I actually learned a lot just in listening to all of you for the past hour. I'd like to also echo kind of the critical time that we're at and the urgency to act. And also not in a panicked sort of way, but I think the optimistic note that you struck there, Steffen, I think is absolutely the right one. There's an opportunity and also an urgency to act. So I do really appreciate your contributions to this. There's a lot more that we didn't get into. So I hope maybe we can have some future discussions and really drill down on some of the specifics here. But with all of that, let me just thank everybody for your participation, thank the audience for your questions, and hope to see you again at a future date.